Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mary Mawadala, and I serve as the Director of Gulf Partnerships at Mercy Corps, and I am joining you today from Dubai. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I recognize several familiar names, so hello again. And I'm equally grateful to welcome some new supporters. I do have to say, we are just so pleased to have such a great turnout of employees from our corporate partner, Xylem. So thank you so much to all of the Xylem employees who are joining us today on this call. We would love to hear introductions from others too. So for everyone joining us from other organizations or individual supporters, please take a moment to add your name and location in the chat. And I have to acknowledge that so many of you have been steadfast partners to Mercy Corps for years. Your leadership and your commitment make our work possible. And I'm always just so amazed by the breadth of this community, from the longtime supporters who have been with us for many years and those who are just starting to get to know us. You are a constant source of inspiration and motivation for our teams around the world. A bit of housekeeping. We wanted to let you know that we are recording this meeting, and we will leave time for questions and answers at the end. So please feel free to make this as engaging as possible. If you have a question, please put it into the chat at any point, and I will be sure that we address it during that portion of the conversation. So to kick us off, I'm just going to give us a brief reintroduction or introduction to Mercy Corps. Mercy Corps is a global humanitarian and development organization working alongside communities on the front lines of conflict and climate change. We partner locally and globally to help people cope with crisis, adapt to a rapidly changing world, and ultimately thrive. And in 2025 alone, we are very proud to share that we reached 37 million people with urgent assistance and long-term solutions. And as many of you know, after more than 40 years as Mercy Corps, we will transition this fall to our new name, Prosper Global. And this evolution reflects who we are today and the future we are determined to build together, a world where every community has the opportunity to prosper. So we're very excited for that official launch in September. But to bring us back to the theme and topic for this conversation, as many of you know, the conflict in the Middle East is unfolding in the context of deep pre-existing fragility across the region and beyond. In places like Lebanon, communities were already on the brink before the latest escalation, and renewed hostilities have pushed the country into a major displacement crisis just as families were trying to recover from previous conflict and years of economic collapse. Mercy Corps' team on the ground is providing meals and cash to displaced families both in and out of shelters to help them meet their most urgent needs. In Gaza, aid access is the difference between survival and catastrophe. When crossings close, even briefly, families lose access to food, fuel, and life-saving medical care. Our experienced and committed Palestinian team in Gaza continues to deliver food, cash, hygiene supplies, clean water, shelter kits, and psychosocial support to their communities while being displaced themselves. And then for me personally, being based in Dubai during this period has also reinforced for me how deeply interconnected the region is. So even in places marked by deep stability and resilience, there's very real awareness of how quickly regional dynamics ripple outward. And to that point, this is not only a Middle East crisis. Countries from far from the war are absorbing the shock through markets, not borders. And I am very honored to be joined today by my colleagues, Kate Phillips Barrasso, our Vice President of Policy and Advocacy, and Melaku Yirga, our Vice President for Africa. We'll have the pleasure to hear insights from Mercy Corps' new report From Hormuz to the Front Lines of Hunger, which traces how conflict in the Middle East is triggering cascading economic and humanitarian impacts far beyond the region, from fuel and fertilizer disruptions in the Gulf to deepening food insecurity across East Africa. Our analysis underscores a critical truth. Interconnected crises demand interconnected, resilience-focused philanthropic strategies. Kate has also just returned from Sudan, where she witnessed firsthand how these shocks are affecting communities. So we'll have a chance to hear a little bit more from her about her trip and what she saw. So without any further delay, I'll pass it over to Kate to share just some further context and analysis. So Kate, please, we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thanks, Miriam, and hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today to hear a bit more about how the conflict in the Middle East is causing these broader ripple effects across the world in places that I think initially people wouldn't actually associate with the Strait of Hormuz, or even that region where we're feeling these impacts really viscerally in some of the communities that we're working with in Asia and in the Horn of Africa. As Marian said, Kate Phillips Barrasso, I'm the Vice President of Global Policy and Advocacy with Mercy Corps. I'm based out of Washington, D.C., and this is an issue that we are advocating on a great deal because it is truly a shock to the global system, and one that is proving to be an accelerant on many other crises that were already being experienced throughout the world by vulnerable communities. So just to kind of ground us, it's been 2.5 months since the outbreak of the conflict in the Middle East at the end of February. And as you might have seen in the headlines today, the political situation remains volatile. There's potential new attacks starting. There are negotiations about an end to this conflict. But the truth is, whether the political situation gets resolved or not, the economic fallout has been significant from this conflict and will likely continue to spread throughout the world, even if we do see a permanent end to hostilities there. So there was a ceasefire announced in early April that eased immediate hostilities. Obviously, we're not seeing the attacks on the level that we were in Tehran and other parts of the region, but it has not restored normal commercial flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Just to give you an idea of what that looked like before, what this really important commercial waterway meant to the world, something like 100 to 130 tankers crossed through this critical strait on a daily basis before the war. And that has slowed even during the ceasefire to something like 3 to 5 tankers a day. So as much as there has been a temporary halt to the hostilities, the economic impact has not changed and things largely remain frozen, which means that global fuel, fertilizer, shipping, and food systems are being impacted. So just to unpack that for you a little bit, I think people don't recognize the importance of some of these corridors until something like this transpires, and we recognize that interconnectivity that Miriam mentioned and how many goods actually come through that strait. The Strait of Hormuz is a very critical energy corridor and trade corridor, and these impacts are reshaping fuel costs around the world, which is probably what we've heard about most in the news. Obviously here in the United States, in Europe, and other places, the price of gas going up significantly, but that really cascades into all other aspects of the economy, right? When fuel prices go up, we see food prices go up, all other commercial goods that need to be transported and produced become more expensive. And also, I mentioned fertilizer. This is a major fertilizer corridor. Urea, one of the biggest and most used nitrogen-based fertilizers in the world, a very significant portion of that is produced in the Middle East and transits through the Strait of Hormuz. So that is also impacting agricultural production, and which I'll talk about in a moment. So this is obviously a highly visible conflict, but what has really traveled under the radar screen are these impacts in further flung places around the world. And as Miriam mentioned, places where Mercy Corps works and where people really don't have the margins to absorb these types of economic impacts, whether they are experiencing conflict, like what is happening in Sudan, hunger, like what we see in a place like Somalia, where there's 6.5 million people who are facing acute food insecurity, rampant inflation, displacement from war or climate disasters or climate stresses, like we see cyclically in the Horn of Africa. So this truly is a compounding effect on what they were already experiencing, because again, these shocks are things that can't be absorbed by people who are already hanging on, by a thread. So just to give you, a bit of an overview on some of these countries, we actually operate in Lebanon, which is impacted directly by the conflict, but was also experiencing a pretty significant and deep economic crisis prior to the war. And now we have 20% of the population of Lebanon displaced as a result of this conflict, but it's also incredibly expensive for those displaced people to be purchasing food and moving around and buying basic goods. In countries, like I mentioned before, Sudan and Somalia, that were already experiencing conflict-based displacement and climate shocks, we are seeing the price of food and fertilizer go up significantly. And that also includes countries like Myanmar, where we work, where people use diesel to pump water out of the ground and have clean water, but also in agricultural activities. And that was also a country that has been affected deeply over the last few years, since there was political conflict and a coup that occurred in that particular setting. So economic shocks are reaching these countries through multiple channels, as I mentioned. Fertilizer, fuel, commercial shipping prices are up dramatically because some of the premiums on commercial shipping have gone through the roof, because insurance agencies understandably are seeing the risk as incredibly high. We're also seeing currency depreciation in some of these environments. So again, what this translates to a displaced family in a place like Somalia is immediate spikes in the cost of food, transport, and essential goods for people who just cannot absorb that extra cost. We're also keeping a close eye, and this is something we'll see where it goes, on remittances. There are something like for example, we're looking at Pakistan, where we work as well. There are 4.5 million people in Gulf countries that send remittances, Pakistani workers that send remittances from places like the United Arab Emirates to Pakistan, and it's a significant portion of their economy. So if we see those remittances go down, if conflict picks back up, that will have a major impact on the ability of households in some of the poorest areas of Pakistan to purchase local goods, which again will be more expensive as a result of these supply chain breakdowns. So we cover a lot of this in a report that we just put out called "From Hormuz to the Front Lines of Hunger," which traces the impacts of the conflict across 6 countries: Sudan, Somalia,
Oh, I think we might have.
the statistics
Uh,
around these shocks and what that looks like. But the bottom line that we wanted to stress on this call was that, even if, again, we find a political solution to the conflict, the reverberations from what has already happened are likely to affect food security outcomes, certainly through the end of 2026, likely into the 2027, and possibly even beyond. And that is because, this is just not a light switch that you can turn on and off, right? When you open the Strait of Hormuz, perhaps more ships will flow through. Perhaps some of those insurance premiums on cargo ships will come down if they're convinced that the risk has been reduced. But the fact of the matter is that the planting season in many countries around the world is happening right now, right? So April, May, land is being prepared in the northern hemisphere for farming in places like Sudan or Somalia. And when you're a small farmer who is trying to buy inputs that are literally double the price of what they were several months ago, it means that you are likely to plant less or to be able to use less fertilizer because you can't afford it, or you switch to less productive crops. And that will mean less food is coming out of the ground in the fall, which means more people will be plunged into a hunger crisis. So to give you just a taste of what is in the report, global urea prices, which I mentioned before is one of the key fertilizers that comes through the Gulf, have risen since the conflict started by 85%, right? So imagine you're a small farmer, you're barely hanging on as it is, and the price of your fertilizer went up by almost 100%, right? Fuel prices in Somalia have more than doubled, which is driving up food and transport and water costs. And just to mention, people think, water costs, how is that related to fuel? A lot of locations around the world, people do use fuel-based, diesel pumps to pull water out of the ground, whether for drinking or for agriculture. And environments like Somalia, where there are a lot of displaced people, water trucking is sometimes necessary. And the price of fuel going up means that the price of water people are purchasing is going up. Same goes for Myanmar, where we've noted 160% increase from the start of the war in their diesel prices, which is affecting agriculture and drinking water. And in Khartoum, in Sudan, fuel prices have risen by 66%, right? So these are massive increases, again, that are causing widespread disruptions in an immediate sense, but also, as I mentioned, again, the impact that they will have, particularly on agriculture, in a sort of medium and long-term way. So what is really concerning to us about this is, the food insecurity picture growing beyond the immediate squeeze that everybody is feeling. And the fact that, there are shrinking aid budgets around the world that are just, this is happening on the canvas of significant cuts that have occurred through the dismantling of USAID here in the United States, but also several European donors cutting, and that will sort of amplify the impact of these shocks that are traveling through the system. So let me just, Miriam mentioned that I had recently traveled to Sudan. I was actually there with Melaku, visiting program sites, including some farm work that we are doing in parts of the country in partnership with the World Bank. Incredibly important work. This is a country where 20 million people are food insecure as a result, largely because of the war. And where existing food production is on a domestic level is really, really critical. But some of the farmers that we spoke to were telling us urea is the primary fertilizer that they use, and that they were noting how much more expensive it was and trying to figure out how they would be producing without being able to afford that. They also mentioned to us that people were not signing contracts. Local producers were trying to partner for inputs and also, for the harvest in advance for the harvest season, and suppliers not wanting to sign contracts because they were afraid that they would be locked into essentially losing money on the business that they were providing because the prices are so volatile, and they were not sure yet if they had reached, the absolute pinnacle of what the prices would be. So there's just a lot of risk and uncertainty in the system right now. So, I'll close by saying, we've seen shocks like this before. We all experienced the COVID crisis, where I think, where it was quite clear to us how interconnected we were around the world, not just through health systems, but supply chains, right? And shortly after that, we experienced the invasion of Ukraine, which, again, I didn't know before that invasion how much of the world's grain came from Ukraine, and particularly to places like Africa, countries that might be import dependent. And so this is something, that is becoming an increasing risk around the world, is when these supply chains get broken. But again, I just want to stress this time, what really worries me as someone who's paid close attention to some of these countries for years, is that the difference between now and when the Ukraine war broke out in 2022 is there really has been this evisceration of the international aid system. And a lot of the supports that would kick in a country like Somalia, or Myanmar or Sudan just simply are not coming forth due to the constriction in the system. And that is what really worries us, because beyond, again, the immediate impacts of price hikes on people's ability to afford food and water, we are quite worried and are hearing estimates like something like 45 million more people worldwide will be food insecure by the end of 2026. And hearing those numbers is quite concerning generally, but very concerning, recognizing that a lot of aid actors have actually been curtailing services globally as a result of these aid reductions. So this may be truly our first major global crisis in what we're kind of calling the post-aid era, where we are going to see what it looks like for people to be pushed deep into food insecurity, children in particular, when the usual actors that would have come there to help mitigate some of the worst impacts are not able to do so under the current context. So with that, we'll be happy to discuss, but I will turn over to Melaku to talk about how our teams on the ground are supporting communities that are experiencing these shocks I just described. Over to you, Melaku.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. I hope you can hear me well, right? Yeah, just trying to ground some of the things that my colleague mentioned. As she said, I was with Kate a couple of weeks in Sudan. So I will be sharing what this means on the ground and some of the work that our teams are really doing in support of the communities impacted by this crisis. So what I really want to bring to your attention is on the economic shocks actually feel like to the families who are living to them. So here, for most people, this crisis doesn't arrive as a headline, as mentioned earlier on, as fertilizer price or shipping routes. It shows up in everyday ways that are just as devastating as what makes the headlines. A field that doesn't get planted, for instance, a water point that runs dry, a family stretching the little they have to make it through another day to feed their kids. Across the region, as my colleague Kate mentioned, our teams are really working with farmers, traders, and displaced communities, significant numbers in Sudan, as mentioned earlier, who are trying to hold on through the shock one after another. So as we know, pre-Middle East conflict, we already have Sudan, one of the largest humanitarian crises at the moment. And this is an additional burden on top of that. And then what our teams are telling us again and again is that it feels extremely hard to move forward when they are managing crisis after crisis. So just bringing in the nature of compounded crisis. So I'll be speaking to you two specific countries in the Horn, one of which, as I mentioned, I visited with my colleague Kate back in April, which is Sudan. In Sudan, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. So before this conflict began, even so, nearly half the population is facing acute hunger, and now the ripple effects from the Middle East that Kate mentioned is really affecting in the form of higher fuel costs, higher import price, shortage of currency, disrupting shipping, adding more pressure into what is happening already. So for farmers, rain-fed agriculture, timing would not be worse. Summer planting season is approaching, it's around the corner, and then fertilizer shortage means many will plant less or not at all even. So when you speak with farmers in Darfur, you hear the same worry again and again. They will plant far less this season because they simply can't afford the factors of production, fertilizer, and the fuel needed also for production. It is a clear sign of how fragile the harvest in this setting is already. The people most exposed are those who were already living on the edge, as I mentioned earlier. Families in or near famine conditions, displaced communities who have fled multiple times, rural producers in Darfur and Kordofan, and households who depend on aid. That is now more expensive to deliver and even harder to move. So while all these great challenges are present in front of us, our teams and the communities, we see extraordinary resilience on the ground. I have seen it while I was in the field. I will tell you some stories from some of the communities that Kate and myself met during our time last month. One of the women in our programs, her name is Yirga, had been displaced 6 times. As I mentioned earlier, there are multiple displacements. So this particular woman has been displaced 6 times before reaching Tawila. When she got connected to emergency cash assistance, she told us something that has stayed with me. You can't think when you are hungry, tired, and scared. With that cash, she fed her children first, then she was able to open a tiny shop. Just a few items to start with, and slowly grew into a business that now supports her family. Today, she mentors other displaced women, as she has gone through also our mentorship program, which one of our programs is supporting. She says, I want us all to eat. I want us all to succeed. That is the spirit we see across Sudan. A culture of sharing, caring, and resilience, even at a time of such critical shortage and crisis. Through Collective Sudan, this is a cash consortium that we are convening about 19 national and international partners and have reached more than 2.6 million people since the Sudan crisis started in 2023, which is about 3 years. What makes this model powerful is really the delivery system, which runs through Sudanese organizations, people who hold deep community trust and connection, and they stay even when conflict shifts. In a crisis of this complexity, working collectively is the way to reach more people and faster even. Another story comes from Kassala, where we met the group, and specifically where Mtital and her women cooperative own 20 fedans. Fedan, by the way, is a local unit of farmland. So just to, I forgot the exact conversion into acre or hectare, but it's a small plot, local measurement that they use. So last year, they have 20 fedan of the land. And then last year, almost all of the 20 fedan dried up. They were only able to cultivate 2 fedans out of 20, which is about 10%, and even the crops failed. So with the introduction of a solar-powered irrigation system installed with support from Mercy Corps and local partners, water now reached the entire area. For the first time, the cooperative has been able to cultivate all the 20 fedans that I mentioned earlier. Last year, they were able to harvest 15 sacks of eggplant. This season, they produced about 150. The cooperative now has enough income to reinvest in the next planting season without taking on debt. And then they are planning also how to expand the production and bring more women into the group as the group size can also get bigger and then have more scale. So this is also tied to the social capital and the connections and the sharing that I mentioned earlier. When you stand in that field with them, you feel what hope looks like, despite all the challenges that I mentioned earlier. So let me take you to Somalia. My colleague Kate has mentioned a bit around the impact. So Somalia entered this crisis already stretched to the breaking point. High dependence on food imports, severe hunger, and a humanitarian response that is chronically underfunded. Today, as I speak, more than 6 million people are facing severe hunger, including nearly 2 million children under 5. To give you context, Somalia's total population is about 18 million. Fuel prices, as mentioned earlier, have more than doubled, and then single fact touches every part of life. The cost of transporting food, price of water, ability of traders to keep their business alive. Rahima, a woman who is selling grain we spoke with, told us that a price of 50 kilogram of wheat or maize has more than doubled. Her customers can no longer afford what she sells. Some days she earns just enough to feed her own family. Some days she earns nothing at all. When markets begin to fail, hunger also accelerates. To help families cope, we are providing emergency cash and restoring access to clean water. Many boreholes had stopped functioning because one, diesel cost is really getting more expensive and even unavailable, as I mentioned. So through our programs, by solarizing these systems, we have cut operating costs significantly and ensured also year-round water access, no matter what happens to global fuel supply chains. And then definitely, as we think about access to water, women and girls are in front and center of that. Before rehabilitation, they spent 2 to 4 hours a day fetching water. Now those hours are reclaimed for school, income, or other engagements and rest. Communities also report from our intervention areas that a 50% drop is highlighted in terms of waterborne disease where reliable supply is restored. So looking at the type of activities, as you can see, we are meeting immediate needs. We are also looking at how do we build long-term resilience, as the context that I highlighted earlier are complex crises. So across East Africa, so young people face some of the highest underemployment, just giving you also the dimension in the broader East Africa region. So you have the highest, or probably one of the highest underemployment rates in the world, and refugees are routinely shut out of formal economic opportunities. This is a region with higher displacement internally, and then millions of refugees in neighboring countries, from Sudan to South Sudan, from Sudan to Chad, from Sudan to Ethiopia, or South Sudan to Ethiopia, the mobility within the Horn and the displacement, some years, if not decades of displacement and refugees in neighboring countries, and some emanating from the most recent crisis, Sudan, that I highlighted. Through one of our programs that I just want to mention is the Job Tech Alliance, where thousands of young people and entrepreneurs are now accessing digital tools, online marketplace, and training that help them also grow their income. So business are growing and hence hiring more people, meaning creating opportunities for young people. Sales are increasing, families are also stabilizing. And then through one of our programs called AgriFin, which is a digital platform supporting smallholder farmers, we were able to support millions of smallholder farmers, the backbone of food production that we know. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa alone, close to 70%, if not 1/3 of the economy is driven by agriculture. So with the digital tools like provision of weather information, insurance, mobile-based credit, we're able to really reach millions of smallholder farmers. So we had an independent evaluations that show that farmers using the service from this project have achieved significant increase in yields, get better prices, and build greater resilience to climate shocks. So just to conclude my notes, what I want to leave you with this is that even in the hardest places that I mentioned earlier, people are not standing still. They are navigating crisis with determination, finding ways to endure, to adapt, and to protect their families. So we at Mercy Corps bring here is the support that helps transform that resilience into real progress, the kind of progress that moves communities from immediate survival, which is critical in a time of crisis, but towards a longer-term recovery, and ultimately the possibility of prosperity. And in a moment when global aid cuts have been unprecedented and devastating, as you all know, your partnership becomes a strategic force and one that shapes the trajectory of entire communities and expands what their future can also hold. Thank you so much for listening to me, and then over to you, Miriam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melaku. And thank you so much, Kate. It's just so incredible to hear these stories from the lived realities on the ground of the people that we work with, as well as this high-level global analysis. And I think I just want to reiterate the point that you were making, Melaku, where this is what really just underscores what makes Mercy Corps unique, and the fact that our teams take this comprehensive approach. We're looking at crises from many different vantage points. We're working globally across the Middle East, East Africa, and beyond. And this really allows us to see how these shocks move across borders, and it enables us to respond in ways that are both immediate and deeply informed by local context. And that combination of global reach and local partnership is what really enables us to support communities before a crisis becomes a headline. So now we'll transition over to Q&A. So please drop your questions in the chat. We want to make sure that we're hearing from you and able to answer the questions that have come up through the conversation. But I did get a question ahead of time from a supporter that I would love to address. Melaku, if I can ask you this, but the question that we have is, I was wondering if Mercy Corps will be responding to the Ebola outbreak in DRC. So can you share a little bit about our plans for the response?
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. Yes, this outbreak was declared on the 15th of May and in 3 locations in Ituri. So of the 3 locations, we have presence in 2 of them, and we have an ongoing program at the moment with a presence in our field office there. So as I report, all our teams are safe, and we are preparing for a response in these specific locations that we have presence at the moment. We are still assessing and coordinating with the Ministry of Health, WHO, and other partners where we can be more additive into responding and containing this outbreak. We are considering a variety of interventions, building on our experience before, as well as we know this is probably, one of the many outbreaks in the same country. So some of our interventions will be looking at providing support to health workers, helping clinic procure needed supplies, and standing up also, working with them to in community healthy hygiene habits, awareness creation, and contributing to the prevention of the spread of the disease. So if there are more, interest to learn about this, we'll be able to share more details. As I speak now, the team is really working long hours in pivoting our current programming and doing coordination with key stakeholders that I mentioned earlier in launching the response in coordination with key stakeholders. Just to highlight what makes these outbreaks especially concerning is the type of strain, which is rare actually. It's called Bundibugyo, where there is no approved vaccine. And there is also limited research behind that. That's really making it more concerning. As I mentioned earlier, Miriam, the good news is that we have deep experience responding to some of the major outbreaks, including Ebola in 2018 in the same country, and obviously the global pandemic, COVID, again, where we were able to support over millions of people through clean access to water, and accurate information and economic support. So we will be really working closely with partners on this, and this is one of the things that keep us awake right now as we speak, on top of some of the crises that Kate and I mentioned in the other parts of the continent.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's remarkable to think about the potential scale that the Ebola crisis could potentially face with these communities. We have a couple of other questions that I see have come up in the chat from Rebecca Ghazian. What can we do from our offices to help support Mercy Corps? I'm happy to take that question on since that's one of my favorite questions to get. And we'll get a little bit more into this at the end of the conversation, but I think one of the best ways to support Mercy Corps is to engage with us online, share more about our work, some of the conversation points that you've heard during this discussion with your networks. Look up your employer match and give your financial support to help us continue to do this work on the ground. If it's of interest, please share the report that we are discussing today with some of your friends and invite them to join us in the next conversation. We would love to include their voice. Melaku, I have another question for you as well. But given some of the impact on water that's developing as a result of the crisis in the Middle East, could you just talk through what Mercy Corps is doing to help communities with sustainable access to water?
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam, for the question. So our water response, I can see a multitude of really ways that we are responding to the water needs. So the first one definitely is immediate access to water, and then keep the waters running despite all the challenges that I mentioned earlier. In many places, I was in Ethiopia for 4 months back, and then quite a lot of the water schemes built years back are motor operated diesel source of energy. Likewise, in the place that I mentioned even earlier, in Somalia and even Sudan. So what we are doing in these localities is really the rehabilitation work is also looking at converting from diesel operated to solarizing the scheme. It has multifaceted advantage. One, more sustainable supply, dealing with also the rising shortage and high price of fuel. By doing that, we reduce the cost of water to families. For instance, in Somalia, fuel prices have more than doubled, as Kate mentioned earlier, driving water transport cost as well. So by restoring and solarizing boreholes, we are helping stabilize water price and reduce the burden on households who are already spending most of their income so on food as well. So the other piece, as I mentioned earlier, relates to the health outcomes and definitely the safety of women and girls as well. As I mentioned, women and girls often work long hours to collect water. So restoring reliable source means reducing risk associated to specific groups of the community beyond the other of the other benefits that I mentioned earlier in terms of sparing the time saved in school income and doing other productive activities. So definitely, as I highlighted earlier, significant also reduction in the waterborne disease and communicable disease. The other piece, as I mentioned earlier in my story, is about agriculture, small-scale solarized irrigation, where communities are not entirely reliant or fully dependent on rain-fed agriculture, which is actually quite challenging in some of the dryland areas. So by installing solarized power irrigation systems, we're able to help also farmers keep fields produce despite rising the costs.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Melaku. Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for bringing it back to life with some of the stories on the ground. I see another question from Ted and Pat Son, who I see you're based in Sleepy Hollow. I actually grew up across the river in Nyack, so great to have a neighbor on the line. But I see their question around how do cash demands impact longer term investment in things like solar, et cetera, from a Mercy Corps point of view in making decisions. And I'm happy to take this question as well. It's true for an organization like Mercy Corps, we are constantly balancing urgent humanitarian needs with longer term investments that strengthen communities over time. Alongside crisis response, we also use impact investing to help promising local businesses grow, create jobs, and build more resilient economies. And these efforts take upfront capital and steady commitment. And at the same time, we need flexible cash on hand to activate quickly in crises that don't make headlines. So the ones where people are suffering, but funding is scarce. And that's why unrestricted support is so critical to us. It really gives us the ability to respond immediately when emergencies surge, while still moving forward on the long-term programs and investments that reduce future need. So thank you so much for that question. Okay, well, I know that we're coming close to time, and I don't see any other questions that are coming up in the chat. So if you do have a question that is top of mind that you'd like for us to address, please feel free to reach out to your Mercy Corps focal point with anything further that you'd like to discuss, and we'd be more than happy to answer those questions. I know Kate has popped a New York Times link into the chat of a recent story that we partnered on with them around the situation in Somalia. So please take a look at that report and also share it with your networks too. And I just have to give a big thank you to Kate and Melaku, and thank you so much to each of you for joining our conversation today. Your partnership is what allows us to stay present in the hardest places and to act quickly when crises intersect. And your support is more critical than ever, and we are just so grateful to be in this work together. So thank you all. And like I shared, if you have any further questions, please do reach out to your Mercy Corps focal point. We'd be more than happy to continue the conversation. And I hope that you all have great days, great evenings ahead. And thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.